In the latest episode of Jobless Reincarnation, Rudy and Paul finally catch a glimpse of what may be Zenith, but as they do, a Hydra whose power may be only second to Orsted presents a kind of challenge that Rudy may not be able to defeat. So to begin, on the 5th level of the labyrinth, what Rudy encounters is what Roxy called a manatite Hydra, and it's the kind of Hydra that, unfortunately for Rudy, especially with the group that he's in, absorbs mana. So with that, it means that Roxy is useless, Rudy is useless, and also Talhan is useless. Now, as for Geese, Paul, and Elise, Geese seemingly is just there to help retreat or maybe shout out instructions, a strategy. Meanwhile, Annalise, she is a notable swords person and has some magical ability, but it's really Paul who's taken on all the work in terms of trying to figure out how to defeat this monster, especially because it seems the only thing that you can really do is cut off its heads. But being that the Hydra not only absorbs mana but also recovers rather quickly, eventually Geese has to step in to help them all retreat and kind of formulate a plan of what to do next. But with having some type of glimpse of what likely is Zenith, it leads to some issues between Paul and Rudy, because Paul is now gung-ho, adrenaline's pumping, while Rudy's very calm and collected. And as you can see from Rudy's little sisters, there's something that doesn't click about Rudy not really being like rammed up. That's a bad way to put it. There's something about Rudy not being really gung-ho, adrenaline pumping, yada 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 like Paul is. And from what we learned, the reason is that Rudy doesn't feel that connected when it comes to Zenith. It's been about 10 or so years since he's seen her, and that's when he was 7 years old. And all the stuff that has happened since then has made it so, yeah, with Paul he has a very volatile relationship, but he has some type of relationship. Zenith is just his mother who, yes, he may have fed from at one time, but what connection is there? And being that when it comes to Rudy, it seems that even in his old life, maybe he didn't have the best relationship with his parents. It means this is his whole experience with having parents, building relationships, reconciling, fighting. So Paul means something to him, Zenith does not, but at the same time, he recognizes that to his sisters, to his father, she does. So as they're brainstorming about how to defeat this creature, he brings up Hercules, burning the Hydra's head so that perhaps he won't be able to recover, and that's the plan to go in with. And to a certain point it works, but one of the problems is that really only Paul's cutting off heads and Annalise is just providing support. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is that because the Hydra scales absorb mana and then it has this protective field over it, that means when it comes to Roxy, that means when it comes to Rudy, they have to get very close, and that includes Talent, by the way. And because now they're not in the distance and Paul and Annalise are doing their thing, that means that Paul's focus has to be split between taking out this multi-head Hydra and also protecting the healer and the spellcasters. This is what causes issues, because while one head after another is getting cut off to the point where the Hydra itself is like biting into itself so we can kind of get past the scarring that Rudy caused so we can grow a new head, Rudy decides to stop moving about as quick as he used to, and even with that foresight eye that he has, he stops long enough to cause an issue where Paul has to push him out the way. And the first time that happened, bad enough, but then it happens more than once, and this leads to a situation where, yes, Rudy and company do defeat the Hydra and also free Zenith, but Paul gets pretty much ripped in half. And unfortunately for Rudy to really put a punch on things, he sees his father die, looking straight at him eye to eye. And while his father dies with a smile on his face, knowing that his son's still alive, that doesn't take away from Rudy perhaps taking on the fact that his father died because of him, and not to mention that Rudy's own lack of awareness caused him to not only lose his father, but also lose his left hand. With all that said, while it's wonderful that Zenith seems to be alive and well, one of the issues that Lilia and Rudy find with Zenith is that whether it's brain damage, memory loss, hard to say, it seems that Zenith might be in some type of infantile state, and it leads to horrified looks from Lilia and also from Rudy, to the point where you have to question, is something seriously wrong? Did they just make the sacrifice for nothing? But unfortunately, it's hard to say, and we have, I think, 2 episodes left, so it's not clear whether or not, with everything that is left to go through, if Zenith may recover, or if it may be a case of that being one of the many stories that have to get pushed off to season 3. So getting to the review section, of course, Paul's sacrifice has to be highlighted, and that's because when you think about Paul's arc from the father who was so upset that his son didn't take the sword play to the point he was really whooping his ass, to the father who basically pushed his son out of the nest so that he would be trained by Ghislaine, see a more harder side of the family so that maybe he would toughen up, to them having these issues that led to Rudy beating him so bad that his little sister became afraid of him, to where they are now. That's an arc. And for Paul to sacrifice himself to protect his son, to allow his son to become a father, to allow someone to be the kind of husband that he wasn't, it definitely, for me anyway, felt like Paul finally had that thing to push him over so that he could redeem himself. And I know for a lot of people, maybe Paul couldn't be redeemed since he did not only bad stuff to Rudy, but he also cheated on Zenith, still probably is cheating on Zenith. And even though he kind of made up for the type of father he was to Rudy through his little sisters, there's still a lot of baggage that perhaps need to be sifted through. But I'm of the opinion that with this death, as traumatizing as it's going to be for Rudy, at the same time, it's also setting a precedent of not only what Rudy doesn't want to be as a father in terms of all the stuff that Paul did when he was younger, but also kind of father he wants to be in terms of all the stuff he did once Rudy was an adult. Which leads to the next highlight. That's just a question of what's happening with Zenith. And granted, we're within the last few episodes of the season, so her having brain damage due to being in a state of stasis for years, that's not necessarily something that we want to see spent a lot of time on, because it's not like this show is an hour. It's a half hour, maybe like 22, 23 minutes, even though there's no commercials. But with that in mind, there's still the question of if she does recover her memories quickly, how she ended up in that situation, what was she going through while she was in stasis. And even though it's not like a high level highlight, it is something that's kind of interesting. Never mind, I do find it kind of odd that Lilia and Rudy's expressions when they realized that she had brain damage was so horrific, because it kind of made it seem like maybe there's something more than what we're taking note of, and just to hear what their point of view is maybe will illuminate maybe something that we're not seeing. Which leads to the last highlight, and just that with recovering Zenith means now we pretty much finished the whole chapter when it comes to the teleportation event. And with that in mind, so comes the question of what's next and what season 3 gonna set up. I mean, naturally we're gonna have Man God show up and say told you so, in terms of Rudy losing his hand because of him going off to save his mother. But there's also the question of, with Zenith being back, what's gonna be done with that, especially when she comes and sees her kids again, well, her daughter anyway, and then never mind how is Rudy's sister's going to take the fact that Paul died, and of course the question of what could he have done more in order to save him. Alongside that, we have Nanahashi bringing back Orsted so that she can perhaps go home. There's also, I mean, I would hope that eventually just Ghislaine comes back, but nobody's really even said her name in the last couple of, I don't think they've said her name in forever. but she's still very much part of our mind. But that aside, one of the things we definitely hope either at the end of this season or maybe at the next season gets brought up is Ariel, and especially with her wanting to call that favor in to maybe take back Asura from her brother, maybe we'll finally find out what happened to Lord Soros, or at least what happened to the Grey Rat family after Lord Soros was assassinated, and maybe that can lead to Avis making an appearance because she was, I'm assuming, in the line of succession, and maybe that can cause some things. But overall, I feel like when it comes to the end of the season, we're definitely going to get a cliffhanger. It's just what exactly are they going to leave us waiting on in terms of this episode, presenting it overall. With Rudy making such an unfathomable sacrifice, it does really push the show to new emotional heights and reminds us that in order for any show to make any battle seem meaningful, you have to remind the audience of what can be lost if anything goes wrong, and that as strong, smart, powerful as any character is, they're still in some ways human and fallible, and one mistake can do so much damage.